They're digging in the wrong place.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Listen to Pavarotti.
Can I be your superhero?
This is going to absolutely blow everybody's mind. And again, we start with a timeline of known documented events in the case. Beginning on November 13th, 2022, the atrocity on King Road. We know that supposedly a knife sheath was found under Maddie Mogan, collected by Brett Payne, transferred to the Moscow PD, put in temporary storage on the 13th, entered into actual evidence on the 14th, and then transferred to the Idaho State Police Lab on the 16th, where they began processing the DNA from the sheath. On November 20th, they came up with a crime scene sample known as Q1.1, the DNA from the strap of the sheath, and they entered it into CODIS and did not receive a match. From that point, the IGG becomes involved. We're not going to talk about that in this one. We're going to talk about some insaneness, I think you will agree. Because on December the 28th, they collected the trash from the Kohberger residence, developed a DNA profile from the trash known as S87.1, which was a DNA profile belonging to Bryan Kohberger's father, Michael. They compared it with an offline Pop Stats parentage comparison to Q1.1. It gave them a 99.9998% exclusion of everybody else but the father of the suspect, according to the lab. It was enough evidence for them to get a warrant for Bryan Kohberger's arrest, and then they arrested him in the early morning hours of December 29th into December 30th. Immediately upon arrest, once arriving at the station, the FBI, Pennsylvania State Police, collected Bryan Kohberger's buccal swab for DNA and his fingerprints. What happens from this point forward will blow your mind as it relates to the evidence that was processed in this case. We're going to compile this timeline now. Everybody is clear on the events up until this date right here, December 30th, 2022. Again, the FBI collected a buccal swab. The Pennsylvania State Police obtained Bryan Kohberger's fingerprints after arresting him. Now, what happens next is the FBI completes their evaluation of all of the hair and fibers in the case, attempting to match them to the suspect, Bryan Kohberger. And we know this because of the FBI laboratory report, where it discusses the communications it had on January 4th, 2023, where they would have let Bill Thompson and the investigators know that all of the hair and fiber collected in this case that they tried to compare against Bryan Kohberger did not match Bryan Kohberger. That means that on January 4th, Bill Thompson and team would know that they didn't have any hair or fiber evidence matching the guy that they just arrested. That must have been shocking for them. So what did they do immediately after that? Immediately after that, they got the Idaho State Police lab technicians to compare Bryan Kohberger's fingerprints to the main piece of evidence that they had in this case that I've said over and over, which was the L5 fingerprint that was produced with Amido black on the rear sliding door, indicating it was a bloody fingerprint. They jumped right on comparing Bryan Kohberger's fingerprints to L5. And you can see on January the 4th, 2023, Haley Youngling of the Idaho State Police Lab excluded Bryan Kohberger as being a contributor to this fingerprint, which I'm sure really shocked the state, considering they hadn't even collected Bryan Kohberger's fingerprints in Idaho on January the 4th. That was simply the fingerprints that they sent from Pennsylvania that they hurried up and tried to compare him to. No match. They would later compare his fingerprints again to the L5 from the fingerprints that they actually collected from Kohberger, but that was immaterial because it was excluded again. So now we know that once Kohberger was arrested, the prosecutors and the state of Idaho knew that he did not match any of the hair fiber evidence in the case. He didn't match the L5 fingerprint on the rear sliding door, likely left in blood. They had a problem. So how did they handle this problem? Very strangely. On January 5th, 2023, the Idaho State Police forensic lab personnel, along with some officers, met Bryan Kohberger at the Liedaho County Jail to collect another buccal swab, more fingerprint exemplars, they call them, and even some more hair from Bryan Kohberger, I guess for later processing, even though the FBI had already obtained, obviously, hair as well, even though I don't have documentation of it because they compared it to the hair. But we know this to be a fact because the field notes on this released forensic report says that on January 5th, 2023, at approximately 13:51 Pacific Standard Time, forensic scientist Tara Martinez and I arrived at the Liedaho County Jail, located in Moscow, Idaho, to assist with collection of photographs, buccal swabs, friction ridge exemplars, that's the fingerprints, and hair samples from one subject, Bryan Kohberger. We were accompanied by Gideon Roberts of the Idaho State Police, Travis Shirley of the FBI. Also present were Ann Taylor, Kootenai County Public Defender's Office, and associates, as well as Liedaho County Jail personnel. It turns out Ann Taylor being present for this is a very important detail we need to remember for later. But what did they collect? Once again, buccal swabs, friction rigs exemplars, which is fingerprints, and hair samples from Bryan Kohberger, as well as photographs. Now, in the notes, we'll see that they got to the Liedaho County Jail and cleared it at what time here? 15:17 Pacific Standard Time on January 5th, 2023. Then they left the jail and they went to the Moscow Police Department at 15:28, just about 11 minutes later. They turned the evidence over to Tim Smallridge at the Moscow Police Department at 15:30 Pacific Standard Time. So they took the fingerprints and the hair and the buccal swabs, because they had already collected all those in Pennsylvania, and did it again and turned it over to MPD and put it in their evidence. And then there's digital images transferred to Talbot, and they cleared the Moscow Police Department at 16:09 Pacific Standard Time. So what's interesting is on January 5th, they get all this evidence. They put it in the Moscow PD evidence storage locker. And I can't find any other documentation of the evidence they collected on that day, between that day, and when they began processing it on January 21st at the Idaho State Police Lab. And the only thing I can find is just more notes, and it says general notes. Total time on scene includes about 6 hours of wait time at Moscow PD on January 5th, prior to the arrival at Liedaho County Jail. So apparently they went to the Moscow Police Department before going to the jail to collect all this, and they spent 6 hours there. And then Tara Martinez puts a note in here on November the 20th, 2023, and talks about on November 14th, 2023. And it says, I don't think we need to put in an entry for the Moscow Police Department. I think we can leave them in for the hours we were on scene since we were not available to do anything else at that time, but I don't think they need an entry according to their notes. But once again, I don't see anything about how the buccal swab and the other evidence got from the Moscow Police Department evidence storage on January the 5th and when they began processing the evidence on January 21st, 2023 at the ISP lab. But I do know that some weird things took place between those dates. So this is really important to know, y'all. On December 30th, when Kohberger was arrested, they had all of this stuff. Buccal swabs, fingerprints, apparently hair, because the FBI told them that his hair didn't match on the 4th. They tried to match his fingerprints against L5 on the 4th before they even collected them, so they obviously had this information. And then on the 5th, they went down and collected it all again, buccal swab, fingerprints, and hair. But then on January the 9th, 2023, something happened that you would not expect, especially considering they already had all this from their suspect in the case. But on January 9th, 2023, instead of processing the buccal swab from Bryan Kohberger, the suspect that was arrested and in custody, and then comparing it to other evidence collected from the crime scene, or even comparing it to the main piece of evidence they arrested him for. Instead of doing that, on January 9th, they decided to take Bryan Kohberger's father's DNA profile from the trash collected on the 28th, that they made a sample of DNA on the 28th and compared it to the crime scene sample on the 28th. They did all this in a matter of minutes, apparently, to get the warrant to arrest Kohberger. But they get Kohberger's buccal swab on January 5th, and they don't even start processing it or extracting anything from it until January 21st. But in between that time, they, on January 9th, for some unknown odd reason, they start comparing Kohberger's father's DNA to all the crime scene samples in the case, even though they knew Kohberger's father was 2,000 miles away during the time of the crime. Explain that one to me. But they took his profile, 87.1, and compared it to item number 23, blood from the above the stairwell between the first and second floor. They compared it to unknown male B, blood on the handrail. They compared it to 40.1 and 40.4, the two samples collected from the glove. They compared it to 1.4, the DNA on the back of the knife sheath. They compared it to the two blood samples they collected from Jack D's apartment. And they compared it to fingernail clippings from all four of the victims in this case. And here is the report proving that they did all of this. 1.4, male E, 87.1 is excluded. 6.1, male E is excluded. That's a fingernail. 9.1, male E is excluded. Fingernails. 10.1, male E is excluded. Fingernails. By the way, look, Maddie, 13.1, they couldn't exclude Kohberger's father as being a contributor to the profile. He was even declared inconclusive. And he was 2,000 miles away. He's excluded from item 23, blood above the handrail. Item 30, male E's not the source. That's unknown male B. 37 and 32, or 37.1, 37.2. These are the DNA samples from Jack D's apartment. Male E is not the source of these profiles. 40.1, that's the glove. Male E is not the source. 40.4, that's the glove. Male E is not the source. And they did all of these. I pulled every STR mix report. They did all of these on the 9th of January, 2023. S81 compared to all of this evidence. All the test runs were on January 9th, 2023. Now, why would they compare Kohberger's father's profile to all of the other evidence in the crime after they collected Bryan Kohberger's buccal swab twice? I can tell you, I don't know. Nobody can explain that to me in logical terms, but here's what I do know. That by doing that, on January 9th, 2023, the state of Idaho would have known with certainty that Bryan Kohberger's hair and fibers didn't match anything from the crime. that Bryan Kohberger's fingerprint didn't match the bloody print found on the rear sliding door, that Bryan Kohberger's blood wouldn't have been in 23, unknown male B, either sample from the glove. It wouldn't have been him in item 1.4, the blood on the back of the knife sheath. It wouldn't have been his blood found at Jack D's apartment, and it certainly wouldn't have been his blood found underneath the fingernails of any of the victims in the case. By running his father's DNA against that, they would have known it wouldn't have been Bryan's as well. So that would have let them know that when they did run Bryan Kohberger's buccal swab against the only evidence in the case that they were hoping matched him, Q1.1, that not only did it need to be a match, it needed to be an astronomical match, like 5.37 octillion to 1, or they had no hope in even bringing this case to trial, much less prosecuting it. That would give them about 5.37 octillion reasons to do everything necessary to make sure Bryan Kohberger's buccal swab matched item Q1.1. But here is the issue. Because the defense team, Ann Taylor, Bicka Barlow, who later joined as a defense attorney but was a defense expert at the time, Elisa Massoff, they would have known that there was manipulation done around the match to item Q1.1 in this case. So they would have done what every attorney and DNA expert would have done in this case, and they would have focused in on item Q1.1 and the father's 87.1 DNA profiles and any manipulation that could have possibly been done around those two profiles. All of the documentation, all of the computer access that they could get to find the manipulation. But unfortunately, what they likely would not have done was focus on where the real manipulation likely occurred.
They're digging in the wrong place.
Which would have been on the actual buccal swab taken on January 5th at the Liedaho County Jail of one Bryan Kohberger, known as DNA profile S108. This would have been the last place that they looked for manipulation. And it's probably the first place they should have looked, as we're going to find. Because when you look at this timeline of events, I think it's very strange now that I have dug in and we see that Kohberger's buccal swab was checked into the evidence at MPD on January 5th. And then I can't find any documentation of chain of custody from the 5th to the 21st. But we know during that time, for some reason, they ran Kohberger's father's DNA against every piece of evidence they had in the case other than Q1.1 that they had already run him against. Why would they do that after having Kohberger's buccal swab already, if not to show them that he wasn't going to match any evidence and they needed to make that match really strong when they do it? Because of all that, I better not see any manipulation around the Kohberger buccal swab in the reports. Yet, what do we find? When we go to the DNA extraction, we know the date that they actually extracted Kohberger's DNA from his buccal swab into evidence. January 21st, 2023. They extracted S108 from case number 4843. Then on the same day, they quantified it. January 21st, 2023. They quantified S108 right here, 4843. On the very same day, they got their quantitation results. 4843, S108, 983,818Y, which is kind of a high ratio right there. But anyway, it was all done by January 21st, 2023. Everything looks right so far. Then on January 21st, 2023, they set up the amplification, the STR amplification for Kohberger's buccal swab here, S108. And on that exact same day, when they processed the amplification, January 21st, 2023, well, they got a a bad injection error and a dilution recommendation here from a couple of other samples that they were processing from different crimes. And you can see that Kohberger's S108 set right here in well 9B. The sample that needed dilution was sitting here in well 11B, same well as Kohberger's buccal swab. And then, the bad injection error shows up right here on this sample in well 9H, which coincidentally, when you take well 9H and well 11B and you draw a line through both of them, they both happen to intersect S108 right here, Bryan Kohberger's buccal swab. Now that might just be a big giant coincidence. I don't know. But I do know this. On January 22nd, 2023, they resubmitted the load sheet with the new dilution for those samples right here, 110 dilution, very next day, and everything seems to have worked from there. They processed everything, put it into STR mix, and in a rush match in STR mix we see right here, on February 3rd, 2023, they compared Q1.1 to Kohberger's S108 and got a 5.37 octillion to 1 match. So when I line this out on a timeline, on January 21st, the DNA from S108 was extracted, quantified, and amplified, but with error in amplification. And then on January 22nd, 2023, the amplification error was corrected and the load sheet was produced. And then on February 3rd, 2023, STR mix produces a match statistic of 5.37 octillion to 1. But it doesn't really work like that, because something happened on January 23, 2022 that we cannot explain that really messes this scenario right here up. You see, January 21st, there was this error down here. So on the 22nd, they had to correct the error and process the load. But when we look close at the error box down here, the error box says the bad injection and the dilution, there's a line through samples needing re-injection setup. It says samples were reset up, no problem, handled it. But it was reset up on January 23rd, 2023 by the lab tech, because it actually notes in the box when that happened. The problem with that is, how do you run a load on January 21st and receive an error and then correct the error on January 22nd? And then put in the notes that you set it back up and corrected it on January 23rd. You see, it doesn't go in order like that. It goes in order like this, which means it doesn't go in order, which means this is a major red flag on S108.
I'll tell you what, as an IT guy, I can't wait for AI to get rid of some of these prosecutors and some of these judges, because they're not doing a good enough job. And you know what? AI should replace you. You should be kicked out of that place. If this is the way you're going to do your job, or lack of your job, you think you're just done when the gavel comes down and there's a plea deal. Well, guess what? AI will outwork you. It'll work 24/7, 7 days a week. And I'll take those results with perfect finality on dates, times, all the laws. It'll point out when there's duplicates and repeats. Us IT guys will make the system better.
That's why I like Grok, because once you get some of these AI systems trained, they'll take out a lot of the bias and they'll really help you find some discrepancies in things. And believe me, they don't want to. You have to really fight with them and show them a lot for them to even acknowledge it, once you remove all of the things that push them in one direction or the other. But in this case, when I'm looking at this specific example, it says why this is more suspicious. The standard lab practice load sheets are typically generated at the time of the run or very shortly after, with the correct date in the header. Comments added later are usually handwritten by the analyst on the existing printed form. Here we have form header dated January 21st, type comment referencing an action dated on January 23rd, 2 days later, a separate reset load sheet dated on the 22nd. This sequence doesn't make logical sense if the comment was typed at the time the form was created. It suggests one of these possibilities. Either the load sheet was reprinted or edited after the fact with a backdated header but a future dated comment. The comment was added in a way that bypassed normal documentation flow, or the administrative error or poor quality control in the lab's paperwork. Either way, this is not clean documentation, and forensic DNA work where the chain of custody and the auditability are critical. This kind of date mismatch on an official printed form is exactly the type of thing that raises legitimate questions about whether the processing timeline for S108 was properly recorded or potentially altered or reconstructed later. Now, combined with previous issues, this adds to the pattern you've been highlighting: sloppy, inconsistent dating around S108's amplification and capillary electrophoresis, extremely fast STR run on Q1.1, low template mixture on the keyboard sample, and other processing quirks. It doesn't automatically prove misconduct, but it does give reasonable grounds to question the integrity of the reference sample processing for S108. This is strong material to raise with a forensic DNA expert or in a discovery motion, specifically asking for the raw FSA.HID files, injection logs, and full audit trail for the 3130 runs on 121, 122, and any activity on 123. Now, we know in this case that the defense asked for and received this, the FSA, HID files, the injection logs, everything on the Q1.1, and I don't know for sure, but likely on the 87.1 runs. I haven't seen anything where they requested those files on the buckle swab run for Bryan Kohberger, because it would have been the last place they would have looked.
They're digging in the wrong place.
Why? Here's why: because standard defense and expert focus areas. In cases resting on a single probative DNA link amid broad exclusions, defense experts typically prioritize crime scene sample integrity, the kinship trash pull reliability, interpretation, and statistics, overall lab procedures. The buccal swab itself often receives less aggressive scrutiny because, first, it was collected directly from the suspect under presumably witnessed conditions, creating an assumption of reliability. Well, we know it was collected under presumably witnessed conditions, and Taylor, his attorney, was there present for them collecting his buccal swab. The defense strategy treats the reference sample as the known truth and challenges whether the crime scene evidence truly matches it. Experts may not deeply probe the references handling unless red flags, delays, unusual prioritization, documentation gaps are explicitly highlighted, or resource constraints. Defense experts have limited time and budget and focus fire on the weakest, most outcome determinative link, the single high match sample, not the seemingly straightforward buccal swab. So the defense team, the experts, everybody in the case likely wouldn't have put any focus on manipulation around S108, Kohberger's buccal swab. It would have been on every other sample. And that would have been the perfect place for them to manipulate results. And there's too many red flags around it for me to say, I don't think they did it. This creates blind spots. If manipulation occurred on the buccal swab, introducing trace amounts of the crime scene profile to produce the desired kinship, consistent result while keeping other comparisons clean, it could explain the entire pattern you described without touching the original evidence. The delays you noted, father comparison first, buccal delayed, would give exactly the window needed for such work.
They're digging in the wrong place.